Good morning, class. This is Mr. Harris with another video lecture for you guys for this week's topic. This week's topic is Africa, independence, and modern issues. Okay. Now, before we get started into what today's lesson is mostly about, I just want to point out again and again, Africa is not a monolithic entity. That means not everybody there is the same, and things are not the same across the different countries. Things are very different from country to country on lots of different levels. So when we talk about poverty and issues like that, know that it's very much localized in some places. It's not the same everywhere around you. This map's a little bit out of date, but I thought I did a decent job of showing you about how much money each person makes in the country, and we can see vast differences. We got at least one place over here, which is Equatorial Guyana, I believe, which makes over $15,000 per person. We still have a bunch of these darker blue countries, a lot of them in the south, including South Africa, Angola, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, where people are making between $10,000 and $15,000 each. And then we go down the list. We got these very poor countries that are doing under $200 per person per year. We want to focus a lot this week over here at the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is the big one right here in the middle. We've learned a lot about its history before. We're going to focus this one on this week because there has been a lot of conflict there, and also because our community has a very large Congolese population. There are over 6,000 people originally hailing from the Congo that live in our community. So I thought it was important for us to know a little bit more history about that place in particular. But again, Africa's not a monolith. We're only focusing on a couple of things. Let's try not to generalize too much and say you know about every piece of Africa besides the specific ones that you did learn about. Now, a quick recap of imperialism. So we did a whole unit on imperialism. This is when the European countries, as well as the United States and Japan, went about the world taking over colonies to enrich themselves. Now, in Africa, this was particularly done by the European nations, and there was this thing called the Berlin Conference, which we learned all about in 1884, when all the European countries sat down together and said, how can we divide Africa between ourselves? Initially, Europeans could only take over coastal territories because of disease and other factors, but eventually, with new inventions such as quinine pills and the machine guns, they were able to take over more and more. And by 1914, most of Africa was conquered by Europeans, excluding those two countries. We've talked about it again and again. One starts with an L, one starts with an E. Liberia, Ethiopia. So again, initially there was some European influence on the coast. We see the British down here, the French over here, and some other regions as well. But then with superior technology by 1914, almost the whole place, except for Ethiopia over here and Liberia, are conquered by the Europeans. Some colonial oppressors kept a light touch, mostly just trying to economically exploit the countries as little as possible. Some had a very heavy touch, but I would say none of them had a positive influence upon the continent. Now, the Europeans had conquered Africa for themselves, but they also all hated one another. And it's really important just to talk about this briefly to understand what's going to happen next. There was a little thing called World War II, with the Nazis and their Japanese allies and the Italians against the Americans, British, where's France? I think they're France is down over here, and the Soviet Union, as well as a number of allies, including China and all these other countries of the world. While these European countries were fighting each other, they were destroying themselves. And after World War II, you had these cities and towns all over Europe that were bombed out, so many dead soldiers, and so much blood and treasure had gone into killing themselves that it became very hard for them to keep up their overseas empires. They beat each other up so much they couldn't keep control of their colonies abroad. Now, these people abroad wanted independence. Many of them were forced to fight in World War II as soldiers for their colonial powers, and they're saying, "Why are we fighting for Why are we fighting for their freedom and independence if we're not getting any of our own?" So a lot of political movements started rising up in these different nations, calling for independence. Now, the Europeans began to lose control of these colonies. There's also this new institution called the United Nations that believes that each people should have the right to their own self determination, aka countries should be free and independent. And beginning in the 50s and then going through the 60s into the 70s, African nations began getting their independence. The first one officially was Ghana. Later on, other countries would follow. And it was different from country to country. Sometimes this process was relatively peaceful, but usually there was a lot of violence involved, either through riots or attacks or things like that, to show the Europeans they no longer had strong control over the countries. Now, the last ones to get their independence were the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, which didn't happen until the 1970s. Now, decolonization is a process that's not just happening in Africa, but it's happening everywhere around the world after World War II. The British and their massive empires, we see all these pink ones over here, including Pakistan, India, Bangladesh over here, Myanmar, all these countries, they couldn't hold on to them after the war. So one by one in Asia, we see India here in 1947, then later on some Southeast Asian countries following. These countries began to get their independence. So it's not just an African thing, it's a whole worldwide movement for decolonization. And these countries often use each other as inspiration and examples of how they too could achieve independence for themselves. Now, in Africa, we see in West Africa was dominated by France. Most of these countries achieved independence around 1960, although the French never really left these places and still kind of control many of them behind the scenes today. The British took a little while longer to leave most of their colonies, which are the ones in green, and then a few of them were actually taken over by white supremacists and continued on in that way until the 1990s. But eventually, all of these countries would gain their independence, with none of them officially being colonies today. However, there were still few left behind that were controlled by the white people. So we see by 1952, only Ethiopia, Liberia, Egypt, and Libya have independence. And then more and more of the non white people gained their independence. South Africa and Angola were still being ruled over. And then eventually, today in Africa, it's all controlled by at least people of that original heritage there. Briefly, to understand what's going on in this independence era, you also got to understand this thing called the Cold War, with the United States and the Soviet Union, communist Russia, competing against each other for domination of the globe. America believes in capitalism and allowing their corporations to make as much money as possible. The Soviet Union believes in communism and that all profit should be shared amongst the people, but really they believe in communism as a all-encompassing ideology, kind of anti-democratic, and they wanted all these countries to trade with the Soviet Union as well. There is some positives about the communist system. There's, of course, positives about the capitalist system, but these two wanted every country to fall in line as either with them or against them. Smart countries could sometimes play these two against each other, but oftentimes countries were caught up in the crossfire between the two. We call it the Cold War because the US and the USSR never officially went to war with one another, but for places like Vietnam, the Congo, others around the world, it was very much a hot war as they supported opposing sides in different civil wars around the planet. And it was no different inside of Africa, where the U.S. and our alliance, NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, tried to maintain as much dominance as possible against the Soviets and their Warsaw Pact, which is their communist pact, arraigned against them. So these red and blue are kind of working against each other, and oftentimes, if one side, or excuse me, if they're with the Soviets, we would back guerrillas to try to fight and overthrow them. And by guerrillas, I mean rebels. So, in a lot of countries around the world, if our group wasn't in charge, we'd pay soldiers to try to attack and to take over. Now, even though these countries receive their independence, there's also this factor called neocolonialism, which our official definition here is the geopolitical practice of using capitalism, business, globalization, and cultural imperialism to influence a country instead of direct military or political control. So France can't just come in with its soldiers and take over a mine and then force them to sell those gold to their people. Instead, they can say, we won't trade with you unless you let French companies have an interest in your economic control. So, neocolonialism is kind of the system that's been left behind in place, in which a lot of the resources of Africa are still being mined to profit European or American companies, and that money is not necessarily going back to the people of Africa. So even though we're doing trade and business with them, a lot of times it's more to the benefit of the European or the Western powers. So we see this difference between old school colonialism. Europeans come in, they plant a flag, and they say, this is my country, versus today we use bankers and businessmen. This guy is holding the flag that says the IMF, which stands for the International Monetary Fund. And how the IMF will work is, let's say a poor country like Egypt wants or needs some loans to build some infrastructure. The IMF says, okay, we'll give you $10 billion to upgrade your roads, but you have to allow foreign companies to come in and have control of different sectors of your economy. So it makes it into a system where all the big global powers and their companies have a finger in the pie of Africa, often at the expense of the people already living there. Now, as a lot of these countries become independents, they have some issues. We'll talk about health here in a second, but for most of these countries during imperialism, their job was to create natural resources and export them out of the country. I know in my classroom, at least, we looked at this picture a while back, but we see how many of them are just raw materials. You dig them up, you ship them, they make the profit off them. Not manufactured goods like automobiles or computer chips in which the people are creating something and earning a profit off that. And this is also part of the whole neo-colonial setup that still exists inside of Africa. And if, for example, your country, like Mali up there, is dependent on cotton, and the cotton crop fails that year, it's not going to be good for your country. In America, we have a very well established, and I'm trying to think of the word right now, diversified. That's the word I was thinking of. We have a diversified economy. So even if this year the soybean crop's not good, we're still doing lots of other things in order to earn a profit. And as part of this neocolonialism as well, countries will invest some in Africa and they'll import goods, but more is being exported. So every year, billions of dollars is kind of flowing out of Africa in the form of natural resources and also in capital flight. So a lot of the Africans who are benefiting own these large companies or local companies, and then when they earn their money, they put their money in banks in foreign countries as well. Um, Even though Europeans and Americans have kind of dominated in Africa since the independence era, there's a new colonial power, and that would be China. That's actually the president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, being represented there, who passed away recently. But China has been investing more and more inside of Africa. Now, they say it's for good, beneficial reasons, allow Africa to grow up their economy. Others are worried about debt traps, in which African loans accept African countries accept loan from China, are unable to pay them back, and then have to turn over assets to the government of China, such as ports and things like that, which we've seen in a couple of places already. If you see where the most things were being imported from back in the 1990s, you see America as a source of a lot of imports for Egypt as well as Nigeria down there. Today, China, China, China. They've replaced a lot of the former colonial powers, like we see this was Belgium in Congo. Today, now once again, it is China. We also see the rise of South Africa, though, as a global trading partner, as we see them dominate a lot of Southern Africa. Okay. There's also health concerns. Probably the most well known around the world is HIV/AIDS, which, although it is a problem in almost every country around the world, it's particularly prevalent in Southern Africa. And we see that there are certain places in Africa where between 10 and 15 to 20% of people are suffering from HIV/AIDS. Can they afford the medication? Are they aware if they have it or not because it's already so prevalent? Are they unwillingly passing it on to other people? And this is one of those conditions that Today in America, if you were infected with HIV, we could put you on all sorts of, beneficial cocktails of drugs that would keep you going and kicking. I mean, Magic Johnson has had HIV for 30 years and he's still alive and doing his thing. But if you don't have access to those drugs and cocktails, HIV destroys your immune system and you can very quickly pass away from it. We also can think about malaria. I've mentioned this terrible disease many, many times in class, and it's spread by mosquitoes. Now, this is a really interesting graph I found. It's showing you how rich a country is versus what percentage of the people get malaria at any point in time. And we see a pretty solid curve here. The more your malaria your country has, the poorer there are. Now, this could be because you don't have the resources to treat people, but it's also the knockdown effect of having malaria in your community. If you are a mother and one of your child catches malaria and cannot go to school, you have to stay and take care of them and are unable to work. So these kind of health conditions kind of drag down the whole economy. I've seen some economists suggest that if malaria was wiped away, we could see the doubling of African GDP, or at least sub-Saharan African GDP, within 10 to 15 years because what a factor this is in reining down their economy. There is another factor we can consider as well as part of a modern issue, and that is a phenomenon called brain drain. And that is that oftentimes in these countries, the best and brightest people go to school, they earn scholarships, they study, and then as soon as they have a degree or the opportunity, they leave to move to a more prosperous country. Now, who benefits from this? The wealthy countries, especially the United States. We take in so many people from other countries, their best and the brightest, who want to better their lives here, and we have jobs waiting for them. Our medical field is becoming increasingly dominated, actually, by doctors from other countries who can't earn the same income in their country, so they come here and fill in this gap where we don't have enough educated people inside of our own country. So this one is looking at doctors in Kenya leaving. So every year in Kenya, a lot of doctors graduate, but a lot of them, as soon as they can, they end up leaving. So they try to go work in the UK, the United States, or Canada, and leaving behind not enough doctors itself in Kenya. And generationally, when you keep getting the best and the brightest coming into your country, that's really beneficial. That's one of the reasons why America has been such a dominant country economically, is we always have these great immigrants coming in with their ideas. But what about the people left behind? If you don't have enough skilled people to take care of your country, it's obviously not a good thing. We also have political issues. Okay, so of course, the hope is for democracy around the world, but for many of the countries, that has not taken place. There are some solid democratic countries in Africa, but there's been a lot of violence, a lot of what we call coups d'etats, in which, in the background, through force, one leader is violently overthrown by another. Oftentimes, they're backed by outside forces. Hmm, let's say there's a new president of a country in Western Africa, and he says we should nationalize the diamond mines. The people should own them instead of the French. The French might find a general who is more willing to support the French interest, give him enough money and supplies, he raises an army, he displaces the president, makes himself president. The French get to keep controlling their diamond mines. And this has kind of happened over and over again inside of much of sub-Saharan Africa. And we have lots of single party democracies in which you really only have one choice of who to vote for, and then a lot of military strongmen who have taken over the countries. And unfortunately, the skills it takes to take over a country don't necessarily have the best skills for ruling over a country and doing what's best for the people. We should also consider that when the Europeans left, they often left behind borders that did not really care about where different ethnic groups lived. And we'll take a look at that in the Congo here in a second. So they drew these borders without thinking about where the borders should actually be. Oh, remember this guy? He is King Leopold II. He was the leader of Belgium in the later half of the 19th century. As the King of Belgium, he got to own what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And if you remember, when he was in charge, he brutally exploited it for its natural resources and for people producing rubber, among other crops. If the local people did not produce enough rubber, he would have their hands chopped off. There was outright slavery, rape, genocide, all sorts of terrible, terrible things happening in the Congo. And that has a long lasting memory through time of what people learned from this and how it impacted families and communities. So, we're going to look a little bit more at the Congo for this week's homework and online remote learning. So this is the area in the middle of Africa, around where Congo is, and we see it here is called Zaire, which is just a different term that was used by a guy we'll talk about in a second. And these are all different ethnic groups that are living in it. So that's a lot of different kinds of people. And we see they're sharing all one country together. One of the things the colonial powers would often do is they would support one ethnic group at the expense of others and say they're the ones in charge. And leaving them behind, this create a lot of hatred between some of these different groups that had a hard time working together and sharing resources. You also need to consider, let's look here in Congo, what if a little people will pick on the Nagata over here? What if suddenly there's a new source of wealth for the country, like an oil or a diamond mine? Should the Nagata get it on their own, or should they have to share with everybody else? What if one of the stronger groups just outright conquers it and takes it over for themselves? And this is something we've actually seen happen a lot inside of the Congo. So the DRC was again formerly a colony of Belgium, and it officially gained its independence in 1960s with a bunch of provisos. Belgium said you have your independence, but we're going to be kind of like a protectorate over you and help control a lot of your politics. And the system they put in its place was kind of constitutionally weak. And there was many provinces that were instantly fighting for their own independence. And the prime minister, excuse me, the president, who was supported by the Belgians, tried to get rid of their prime minister, who we'll talk about in a second, resulting in a crisis. Eventually, the military seizes power. Okay, so I got to talk real quick about one thing, and it's cobalt. Cobalt is a natural mineral that you probably don't think a lot about, but in lots of things that you probably use. It's in your smartphone batteries, it's in electronic components, it's in all sorts of things. It's often used in airplanes, it's often used in weapons manufacturing. It's a very valuable mineral. In 1960, there were two nations that we knew possessed a lot of cobalt. One of them was the Soviet Union, who refused to trade with the United States. The other one was the Congo. Okay? When the prime minister at the time tried to say, hey, we might not trade with you, we could not accept that as an answer because the United States felt like it needed to have this natural, which is our guy here. His poster is actually in my classroom. It's in the right-hand corner. You might have noticed him, but his name is Patrice Lumumba, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name. He was the original prime minister of the DRC. He wanted to do what was best for his country and was often willing to play the two sides of the Cold War, USA, USSR, against each other to get what was best for him. Unfortunately, the West considered this a threat. We couldn't let our precious cobalt get in the hands of only our enemy, so he was captured, and with the okay from the CIA, the US, and the Belgian government, he was assassinated. And he has some really brilliant writings. I've listened to some of his speeches and stuff, and it makes you think, what could have happened with this country if this guy would have kept remaining in charge? Not saying he was perfect, but instead of him, we get a military dictatorship. Eventually, Joseph Mobutu, that's his Western name. I think it's Sisi Siko Mobutu is how you'd say it in the Congo, was supported by the United States because he said, I don't like socialism. I'm against communism, so he must be a good guy, right? Sure. So we gave him support. We said he's the legitimate president, and he was a terrible leader in many ways. Lots of human rights abuses. He collected all the profit earned in the country for himself and his people. He enriched himself. When other countries would send aid, it would often end up in his pockets. He's also somewhat famous in the United States for hosting the Rumble in the Jungle boxing match between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman back in the 1970s. This guy was in power for about 30 years, and some of these strongmen were very successful for long periods of time. Eventually, though, he was forced out. You guys will read more about him in a little while. Now, the economy of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in resources, incredibly wealthy, okay, but on paper, still very poor for the average person. They estimate is about $24 trillion of mineral reserves that have yet to be mined. Um, so most of their money in the country is made by mineral exports. But wars, conflict, exploitation by the West, different rebel groups taking over mines, then funding violence with them, has led to massive amounts of poverty among the Congolese people. Nearly two-thirds of Congolese people are affected by malnutrition or not getting enough to eat. And we see here kind of how it was pretty stable, although very low, the GDP, and then starting in the 80s and then through the 90s and the early 2000s, there's a lot of wars in this period. It gets lower and lower, although it's gone back up to about $580 per person today. Okay. Now, since 1997, there have been many attempts to have free elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but they have often failed. There's been a lot of foreign interventions, and there was this Rwandan civil war, including genocide, that destabilized, I'm sorry, there's some grammar mistakes, the entire country. There's continuing corruption, conflict, and disease outbreaks, which meant that even the most recent election was in question, but things appear to be getting a little bit better. Despite this, there is a ton of really smart people who are coming from the Congo who are kind of really making their impact on the world stage. So this is one of the wars you guys will be looking at in your video and your readings this week, with the Congo in the middle, and then, I shouldn't put that picture there, but all these other countries were sending troops into the Congo. One of the sad things about some of these African wars in the 90s is the presence of child soldiers. Okay, so this week we've got a crash course video talking about this war and a couple of questions that goes along with it. We also have a news article and some questions. And then I will put up a selection of different videos about different topics in Africa and ask you guys to write a little journal entry for that. If you have any questions or anything, please email me and I'll try to get back to you guys as soon as possible. Thank you very much and have a great day.